Hi, it's Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, is it possible for one piece of gear to sound objectively better than another piece of gear? Is it possible for a particular approach in music production, a particular technique, to be objectively wrong or objectively a good one? Is there such a thing as objectively good sound quality? What about formats like, can vinyl records sound objectively better than CDs or vice versa? This is something that I want to get to the bottom of with you in today's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. This one was inspired by listener questions. So if you like listener questions, you can send me one. Just type one into the comments below if you're on the video version of this podcast, or you can shoot me an email at podcast@sonicscoop.com if you prefer to listen to the audio-only version. I recently had the question posed to me. Someone was given the advice of, it's objectively wrong to use a limiter on your mix bus. Is that possible for something to be objectively wrong? And if so, what techniques are objectively wrong and objectively right? Or is it all subjective? Let's get into that and a whole lot more. I've got a lot of thoughts for you. I've written articles about this in the past. I'm going to draw on some of those, and I'll give you some new thoughts today as well. Before we get into it, I just need to give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. Who are our sponsors? Well, if you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, you probably already know the most important sponsor on this podcast is you. How do you sponsor? With your likes. Your love also helps. We only need your likes for the YouTube algorithm. You can also hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell, but really the best thing to do is sponsor yourself. You can do that by checking out one of our full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs that will teach you to mix faster, better, with more creativity and more confidence than ever before. Your finishing rate on mixes is going to go way up. Your time to complete mixes is going to go way down, while your quality and creativity in your mixes goes way up. Is all of that possible? Absolutely. And there's a 30-day money-back guarantee on it, so you've got nothing to lose. Check it out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Or if you prefer to learn everything that I know about mastering, check out our full-length course on mastering called Mastering Demystified over at, you guessed it, masteringdemystified.com. Big shout out and thanks to our brand sponsor on this week's episode. It has been Sound Toys, sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Check out anything they make totally for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into this week's episode. All right, objectively right techniques, objectively wrong techniques. Can one format or one piece of gear be objectively better or worse than another? I want to start out with the easiest low-hanging fruit here. Let's explore this idea of what objective versus subjective even means, because some people use those words wrong, like a lot. I hear it often. One big thing I used to hear way back, not so much anymore these days, is that, oh, vinyl sounds objectively better than modern digital formats, or tape sounds objectively better than modern digital formats, or super high resolution audio sounds objectively better than MP3s. And I've done whole episodes about all of these ideas, but the long and short of it is, I think vinyl can sound awesome. I think tape can sound awesome. And they can sound subjectively better than modern digital formats. But they objectively sound worse. And I can say that as a matter of fact, because objective means that we're talking about a fact that can easily be demonstrated and easily observed and tested by a third party. So what do I mean about things like tape and vinyl sounding objectively worse, even though they might sound subjectively better to me in certain contexts? Well, objective when it comes to audio quality means, does the thing that you have captured or are playing back, does it sound more like the source or less like the source than something else? So we take something, whether it's the sound coming out of a microphone, or a mix that you've completed, or a remaster that's going onto a final format. We take that initial sound impulse. We can take measurements of what's actually going on in it, the amplitude, the frequency response. We can look at the transients. We can look at slew rates of things. We can look at all of these technical ideas around audio, measure them, and then say, objectively speaking, with everything that you can measure when it comes to sound, does this format or this device sound closer to the source than another one or less close? If it sounds closer to the source, it's objectively higher fidelity. If it sounds less like the source or measures less like the source, it is objectively lower fidelity. And that's something that we can say with some significant degree of certainty. But that tells us nothing at all about what sounds better to us personally. That's the realm of subjective. The only tape machines that have ever performed anywhere near the fidelity, objectively speaking, of cheap modern digital converters would be like the highest end tape machines ever made, running at 30 inches per second. Those might sound pretty much indistinguishable from the source. They might sound pretty much like exactly the same as what you were feeding to them through a mixing desk. Something easily accomplished by a lot of the cheapest converters and interfaces available today. And this is something that you can say with objective certainty. But subjectively, man, it's a totally different story. You might love the way vinyl records or tape running at 15 IPS or 7.5 IPS sound. And the reason that I like tape, and I like using tape and tape emulation to this day, is because it sounds less like the source in a way that's awesome. So objectively, lower fidelity, objectively, lower sound quality in almost any aspect you can measure, but subjectively, maybe more badass. So with that out of the way, how does this relate to other ideas? Can certain techniques be objectively wrong? Because that was the crux of the remarks that were like the seed for this episode. The idea of using a limiter on your mix bus being objectively wrong. I won't go into names and repeat who gave this advice. I'm sure you can find it if you're clever enough. But I just want to get into that idea. Can a technique be objectively wrong? And then we'll talk, having talked about gear and techniques, we'll talk a little bit about music and end result and musicianship as well. So the idea of a technique being wrong, is it objectively wrong to put a limiter on your mix bus? Or is it objectively wrong to do anything? Maybe somebody thinks it's objectively correct to always put your EQ before your compressor. I don't mean to pick on this one example or this one person, but this idea sometimes comes up of there being a right way to do things. Or objectively speaking, you should never do more than 2 dB of compression on your mix bus. Or objectively speaking, you shouldn't EQ things in parallel. Or objectively speaking, EQing individual mics on drums is a bad idea because of phase shift, or whatever it is. You've got to separate one thing from another. And one thing is the technique you're using getting you closer to your desired result? And you might be able to be objective about that. I was trying to make this sound brighter, and you have some objective standard by what brighter means. And you can measure the sound got brighter. It objectively got me there. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe you're objectively chasing after some subjective change in value. That's a mind bender, right? Let's think about that for a second. I want it to sound tighter. Oh man. What does tighter even mean? First, we've got to define that. We could get into all these crazy objective measurements about what tighter means and can we measure that? Well, here's one possibility. You play the sound for 5 different people and ask them, does this sound tighter or fatter to you? And if 4 out of 5 of them say, that sounds tighter, then you objectively got closer to that goal, right? So maybe there's some objectivity there. But ultimately, to you, did whatever technique you're using get you closer to your desired result? And if so, then good job. Was your desired goal the right goal? Well, that is a totally different question. And that is one that is purely subjective in most cases, particularly in the case of music production. There are other art forms and other technologies where there are more standards. There are loudness standards in broadcast and delivery standards in certain mediums, but those don't exist in music production. And thank goodness, we are the freewheeling Wild West when it comes to music production, at least in theory. I'd actually argue that in practice, most people who do music production and most musicians are somewhat conservative. I don't mean this in the political sense. I mean that people are somewhat conservative in the sense of we're still using the same microphones the Beatles used and talking about how great those sound. And people will often really rely heavily on the advice and the workflows and the processes of people who came before them. But that doesn't mean that those people are objectively right, or the microphones that the Beatles used objectively sound better than other microphones. It means that you have subjective tastes formed by years of listening to other records. And when someone goes totally left field on a production in your genre, you notice, and you might say, oh man, this just sounds wrong. Or you might say, wow, that was bold and brave. How cool of them to buck the trend. But all that aside, there is no standard workflow in music production. There are literally no precise rules for music production. And I mean that as literally as possible, in that you do not have to release your music as a 16-bit 44.1K release and have that be full resolution audio for you. You do not have to release your music as MP3s. You do not have to release your music as high resolution audio. You don't have to release your music at all. But if you do, you could make wax cylinder recordings today and sell them to people, and that would be okay. You wouldn't be breaking any rule. You could release your music on some weird next generation format that nobody owns, and you're still not breaking any rules. You could smash things until there's 1 dB of dynamic range. You're still not breaking any rules. You can make your mix or your master so impossibly quiet that, in my opinion, it's pretty dumb, but you're still not breaking any rules. Now, with all that said, there are workflows that are likely to be more productive for you and workflows that are likely to be less productive for you. And I actually encourage people to adopt a systemic approach to mixing, to create a process, to get kind of a roadmap to mixing. This is what the whole course, Mixing Breakthroughs, is about. It's a repeatable process that's gleaned from studying the best mixers on the planet for more than a decade, finding out what they do, and then coaching a whole bunch of other people, both my mastering clients and mix coaching students, and figuring out what helps them get better results, and turning that into a basic template, an order of operations that anyone can apply as a starting point in their mixes. So I'm very much into the idea of like, here's something that works, do it, and then be creative within those confines. With that said, none of these things are objectively rules. I mean, they're heuristics, rules of thumb. I guess that's close to being a rule, but rule of thumb is really a euphemism for something that works some of the time, and you may as well start out by trying this rather than something else. And this is not to be wishy-washy about the advice I give, it's to be precise. So is using a limiter on your mix bus against the rules or objectively wrong? No. Because there literally are, objectively speaking, no rules when it comes to releasing music. Subjectively, you might think it's a bad idea. Or objectively, you might have noticed, hey, I've been coaching all of these clients, and the ones who use limiters on their mix bus, their mixes, to me, tend to sound better or worse. Or their mixes tend to sell more copies, or we put them out to a panel of listeners and they're likely to judge them higher or lower. Like that could be potentially objective information that you could collect. But ultimately it comes down to, again, whether the technique that you're applying gets you closer to where you want to end up or not. And I will tell you that there are a significant number of major mixing engineers who do amazing work, who put limiters on their mix buses. They usually, most of them, don't lean very hard into them, but they often find that they get better results. And I would admit that the best projects I've ever worked on as a mastering engineer were the ones where I had to do the least, where the mix came into me sounding more like a finished master. But this is not to say that everyone should start using a limiter on their mix bus either. I, generally speaking, think it's bad advice to use a limiter or significant amounts of compression on your mix bus when you're just starting out. Because in the first few or even several years of doing audio and music production stuff, you probably can't even hear compression that well. And not doing very much of it is probably a good idea, especially on something like your mix bus. But then I also have to notice that so many of the best mixers on the planet use some mix bus compression and some of them use limiters. Is it doing something for them? Is it helping them get closer to their end result? Is it making the final product that comes back after mastering more predictable and more like what they were expecting to hear when they were working on it in their room? Maybe. Is it maybe a more advanced technique that's not for everybody? Maybe. Is it something that you don't have to do at all and you can make banging, awesome sounding records without doing it? Absolutely. There are, however, such things as best practices. Things that a lot of sensible practitioners would agree on as making sense. For instance, if you are going to mix through a limiter or you are going to mix through a compressor, a best practice here is to mix through them and put them on relatively early in the process. And then don't take them off, because every mix choice you make is going to be informed by what that mix bus compressor and or light limiter is doing. And if you take them off at some point, your mix will kind of fall apart because all of the mix decisions you make all of a sudden change. And I've occasionally seen the feedback of, I don't like mixing through a compressor because if you do and then you take the compressor off, your mix falls apart. It's like, duh, you mixed through the thing. Every single choice you made was informed by having it there. Taking it off, probably not a good idea. It is now part of your mix. But strictly speaking, that's a best practice, not a rule. Those are two different concepts. No one's enforcing it. There's also the situation where things can be objectively true, but not really matter that much. For instance, when it comes to super high resolution audio, if you were to measure a 24-bit 96 kilohertz recording, super high resolution audio, and then measure a 320 kilobits per second MP3, you could find differences between them, particularly if you're going to flip the polarity on two channels in stereo, then all the gobbledygook gets revealed, and there are going to be some differences that are measurable between those two formats. So you could say that a super high resolution recording, or even just a standard resolution WAV file, objectively measures closer to the source than the relatively high-res MP3, 320 kilobits per second MP3. However, when you do double-blind listening trials and you have a bunch of golden-eared listeners listen to the super high-resolution format and the 320 kilobits per second MP3, basically none of them in a proper double-blind listening test can distinguish between the two of them. So by that objective test, they're the same, even though by another objective test, they're different. Because we can measure differences much smaller than the differences that we can hear. So sometimes things will measure differently, but not actually matter to real human being listeners, because we don't have super sophisticated measuring equipment built into our heads, at least not as super sophisticated as the technology that we're able to develop. I mean, as far as organisms go, our ears are pretty amazing creations, and they really do an amazing specialized task, but we've created technological devices that can hear things and hear differences that our ears can't hear. So you can say things objectively about what occurs when you're doing any particular technique, but you cannot say objectively whether a technique is right or wrong. Arguably, you could get close to saying objectively the technique you used helped you get closer to or further from the result you were seeking. But then it comes down to whether the result you were seeking is any good to begin with, and whether getting there is even a good idea. And there's really only one answer, which is there's no arguing about taste. But if you already have some subjective tastes, and you're trying to find ways to more reliably get to what you're trying to achieve, that's where advice from other people comes in handy. And where you might be able to say, this particular technique, in this particular case, objectively got me closer to or further from what I was trying to achieve. And there's a number of people to learn that kind of stuff from. If you've been listening to me talking for this long somehow, I have no idea how you did it, but clearly you don't mind hearing me talk, in which case, what better person to learn some of that stuff from? Again, if you like this podcast episode, you can sponsor yourself by checking out one of my full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs that will give you a system for mixing that'll teach you to mix faster, better with more creativity and more confidence than ever before. By adopting a step-by-step process that's culled from my experience of interviewing, studying, sometimes working under or alongside, and producing masterclasses with some of the best producers, mixers, and engineers on the planet. I've been doing that for more than a decade, picking their brains, in addition to doing this stuff for a couple of decades and coaching others to get better and better quality mixes year after year. If you want my full-length course on it, you can check it out at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Hope you enjoy it. It's got a 30-day money-back guarantee. Or if you want to learn everything that I know about mastering, which is why I do day in and day out as my audio work these days, you can check that out over at masteringdemystified.com. Big shout out and thanks again to this week's brand sponsor, SoundToys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. You're absolutely going to love their stuff. Thanks again for hanging out with me. This has been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. See you next time.